Sarah Martinez had always believed that bruises were just part of life. At 22, she couldn't remember a time when her stepfather Robert hadn't left marks on her arms or when her mother Linda hadn't looked the other way. The small apartment in downtown Phoenix felt like a prison with its peeling wallpaper and the constant smell of cigarettes and cheap beer. Every morning, Sarah would carefully apply makeup to cover the purple fingerprints on her wrists, the result of Robert's latest drunken rage. She worked double shifts at the local diner, saving every penny she could in a small tin box hidden under her mattress. The dream of escape kept her going through the endless nights of fear and pain. "You'll never amount to anything," Robert would slur during his nightly tirades. "No man will ever want damaged goods like you." His words cut deeper than his fists sometimes, but Sarah held on to a flickering hope that somewhere out there was a different life waiting for her. The night everything changed started like any other. Sarah had just finished her evening shift at Murphy's Diner when the thunderstorm hit. Rain poured down in sheets as she hurried toward the bus stop, her worn sneakers splashing through puddles on the cracked sidewalk. The last bus had already left, and she faced the prospect of walking home in the storm. As she stood under the flickering streetlight, shivering in her thin uniform, a sleek black car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, revealing a man who looked like he had stepped out of a magazine. His name was Alexander Cross, though she wouldn't learn that until later. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the storm, and his pale skin seemed to glow under the streetlight. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice smooth like expensive wine. There was something about his accent that she couldn't place, something old-fashioned and refined. Sarah's mother had always warned her about strangers, but standing there, soaked and desperate, she found herself nodding. The interior of the car was immaculate, with leather seats that felt like butter and not a speck of dust anywhere. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, something beautiful and haunting she'd never heard before. "I'm Alexander," he said as they drove through the empty streets. "And you're Sarah Martinez. You work at Murphy's Diner on 5th Street. Sarah's blood went cold. She hadn't told him her name or where she worked. "How do you know that?" Alexander smiled, revealing teeth that seemed unusually white and sharp. "I make it my business to know things about this city, especially about people who interest me." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, they had arrived at her apartment building. But instead of stopping, Alexander kept driving. Panic rose in Sarah's throat as familiar streets disappeared behind them. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, reaching for the door handle. It wouldn't budge. "Somewhere safe," Alexander replied calmly. "Your stepfather is particularly violent tonight. The police will find him passed out in about an hour, and your mother will spend the night in the hospital." Sarah stared at him in shock. "What are you talking about? How could you possibly know that?" Alexander pulled into the parking lot of an elegant hotel downtown, one Sarah had only seen from the outside. The Crimson Tower was the most expensive hotel in Phoenix, with doormen in red uniforms and marble floors that gleamed under crystal chandeliers. "Because I arranged it," Alexander said simply. "Robert won't be bothering you anymore. He's been fired from his job, his credit has been destroyed, and by tomorrow morning he'll be on a bus to another state with just enough money to start over somewhere far away." Sarah's mind reeled. None of this made sense. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" Alexander turned to face her fully, and in the dim light of the parking garage, his eyes seemed to glow red for just a moment. "I want to offer you a choice, Sarah. You can go back to that apartment, back to the bruises and the fear and the endless cycle of pain. Or you can come with me. Come with you where? To a life you've never imagined. Wealth beyond your dreams, power, respect. All I ask in return is your companionship, your loyalty." He paused, studying her face. "Your blood." The last words sent a chill down Sarah's spine, but strangely, she wasn't afraid. After years of living in terror, there was something almost refreshing about someone being direct about their dangerous intentions. "You're insane," she whispered. "Perhaps, but I'm also your only way out." Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. The stone was deep red, almost black, and seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Marry me, Sarah. Tonight, I'll give you everything you've ever wanted. I don't even know you. You know enough. You know I have the power to remove Robert from your life with a phone call. You know I can provide for you in ways you've never dreamed of. And you know that going back to that apartment means more years of the same hell you've been living. Sarah looked at the ring, then at Alexander's pale, handsome face. Everything about this situation screamed danger, but it was a different kind of danger than what waited for her at home. This was the unknown versus the certain misery she'd been trapped in. "What exactly are you?" she asked quietly. Alexander smiled again, and this time she was certain his canine teeth were longer and sharper than they should be. "Let's just say I'm someone who appreciates the finer things in life, including the taste of fear, desperation, and hope mixing together in someone's blood. Any sane person would have run screaming." But Sarah had stopped being sane somewhere around her 15th birthday when Robert's abuse had escalated from harsh words to brutal violence. She was tired of being afraid, tired of being powerless, tired of having nothing and no one. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "what happens then?" "Then we go upstairs to the penthouse suite I own. We have a small ceremony with a justice of the peace who owes me several favors. You become Mrs. Alexander Cross, with all the privileges and protections that name carries in this city. And then we begin your new life." Sarah looked out the car window at the glittering hotel, then back at the strange, dangerous man beside her. "And if I say no, then I drive you home and you never see me again. Robert will be gone, as promised, but you'll be on your own to figure out what comes next." The choice hung in the air between them. Sarah thought about her tin box of saved money, probably enough for a bus ticket and a week in a cheap motel. She thought about starting over with nothing, no family support, no connections, no safety net. Then she thought about the ring in the velvet box, about the power in Alexander's voice when he said he owned the penthouse, about never having to be afraid or hungry or alone again. "Okay," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "I'll marry you." Alexander's smile was triumphant, predatory, and somehow pleased all at once. "Excellent choice, my dear Sarah. You won't regret it." As they walked through the opulent lobby of the Crimson Tower, Sarah caught sight of herself in the mirrored walls. She looked small and shabby next to Alexander's elegant figure, but there was something different in her eyes already. A spark of hope she hadn't felt in years. The elevator rose smoothly to the top floor, and Sarah wondered what she had just gotten herself into. Alexander's hand was cold when he helped her out of the elevator, and she noticed he cast no reflection in the polished elevator doors. But by then it was too late to change her mind. The penthouse was like stepping into a different world. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Phoenix stretching out in all directions. The furniture was antique but pristine, as if it had been frozen in time. Oil paintings in heavy gold frames decorated the walls, portraits of people in old-fashioned clothing who all shared Alexander's pale complexion and dark hair. "Family?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the paintings. "In a manner of speaking," Alexander replied. "They're all gone now. I'm the last of my line." A man in an expensive suit was waiting in the living room, along with a woman in judicial robes. The justice of the peace looked nervous, constantly checking her watch and avoiding eye contact with Alexander. "Judge Patricia Williams," Alexander said by way of introduction. "She'll be performing our ceremony. This is my attorney, Marcus Webb. He has the marriage certificate and all the necessary paperwork." Everything moved with surreal efficiency. Sarah barely had time to process what was happening before she found herself standing next to Alexander, promising to love, honor, and obey a man she had met less than an hour ago. The ring slid onto her finger with surprising weight, and she noticed it was warm despite Alexander's cold touch. "You may kiss the bride," Judge Williams said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander's kiss was gentle but cold, like being kissed by a statue. Sarah felt a strange tingling sensation where his lips touched hers, as if something fundamental was changing in her body. When they broke apart, the judge and attorney hurried out of the penthouse as if they couldn't leave fast enough. Sarah found herself alone with her new husband, still wearing her diner uniform and trying to process the magnitude of what she had just done. "Hungry?" Alexander asked, as if they hadn't just gone through one of the most important moments in a person's life. Sarah realized she was starving. The adrenaline and shock had masked her hunger, but now it hit her like a wave. Yes, actually. Alexander led her to a dining room with a table that could easily seat 12 people. It was already set with china and crystal that looked like it belonged in a museum. A meal appeared as if by magic, brought by servants Sarah hadn't seen enter or leave the room. The food was unlike anything she had ever tasted. Every bite seemed to explode with flavor, from the tender steak that practically melted in her mouth to vegetables that tasted like they had been grown in paradise. She had been living on ramen noodles and day-old pastries from the diner for so long that she had forgotten food could taste like this. "Better than Murphy's Diner?" Alexander asked with amusement, watching her eat with obvious pleasure. "This is incredible," Sarah said between bites. "How is it possible that everything tastes so good? When you've lived as long as I have, you learn to appreciate quality in all things." Alexander hadn't touched his own plate, Sarah noticed. Instead, he sipped from a wine glass filled with something dark red that didn't look quite like wine. "How long have you lived?" Alexander's eyes glittered in the candlelight. "Long enough to remember when this city was nothing but desert and hope. Long enough to see it grow into what it is today. Long enough to own most of it." "What do you mean?" "I mean that very little happens in Phoenix without my knowledge or permission. The mayor takes my calls. The police chief asks for my advice. The biggest businesses in town pay me rent or owe me favors." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah's face. "You've married into considerable power, my dear." Sarah set down her fork, suddenly feeling overwhelmed. "I don't understand any of this. Who are you really?" "What are you?" Instead of answering directly, Alexander stood and walked to one of the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights twinkled below them like earthbound stars, and Sarah could see why he might feel like he owned it all from this height. "Tell me, Sarah, what do you know about vampires?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's first instinct was to laugh, but something in Alexander's tone stopped her. He wasn't joking. "Vampires aren't real," she said slowly. "They're just stories, movies and books." Alexander turned back to her, and in the dim lighting, his pale skin seemed to glow with an inner light. "Are they? Then how do you explain my ability to destroy Robert's life with a phone call? How do you explain the way I knew exactly where to find you tonight? Exactly what you needed to hear?" Sarah's mind raced, trying to find rational explanations for everything that had happened. But the more she thought about it, the less sense any of it made from a normal perspective. "The servants who brought dinner," she said suddenly. "I never saw them come in. Very observant. Your reflection in the elevator. You noticed that too." Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "This is insane. Vampires don't exist. They're myths." Alexander moved faster than should have been possible, suddenly standing directly in front of her. This close, she could see that his skin was flawless, without a single line or blemish. His eyes, which had seemed dark brown in the car, now appeared to be swirling with flecks of red and gold. "Myths have to start somewhere," he said softly, "usually with truth." Before Sarah could respond, Alexander gently tilted her chin up and smiled. His canine teeth had definitely grown longer and sharper. She was certain of it now, but instead of fear, she felt a strange calm washing over her. "Don't be afraid," Alexander murmured. "I chose you for a reason, Sarah. You're stronger than you know, braver than you realize. And you have something I haven't encountered in a very long time." "What's that?" "The ability to surprise me." Alexander's fingers traced along the side of Sarah's neck, and she felt her pulse quicken under his touch. "I could have simply taken what I wanted from you, fed on your fear and desperation, and left you empty. But there's something about you that made me want more." "More what?" "A companion, someone to share eternity with. Someone who understands what it means to survive against impossible odds." The weight of his words settled over Sarah like a blanket. Eternity. She was 22 years old and had never thought much beyond next week's rent money. "You want to make me like you," she said. It wasn't a question, eventually. "When you're ready, when you choose it freely." Alexander stepped back, giving her space to think. "For now, you're simply my wife. You'll live here, want for nothing, have access to pleasures and luxuries you can't imagine. All I ask is your companionship and your willingness to let me feed when I need to." Sarah touched her neck unconsciously. "Feed on me? Just a little, just enough. You'll barely feel it and it won't harm you. Think of it as rent for this new life." It should have been the most terrifying conversation of Sarah's life. Instead, she found herself considering it with surprising calm. She had spent years giving pieces of herself to people who hurt her, who took her strength and gave nothing back. At least Alexander was being honest about what he wanted. "And if I change my mind? If I want to leave?" Alexander's expression grew serious. "Then you leave. I won't keep you prisoner, Sarah." "That's not what I want, but I could never tell anyone about you." "Who would believe you?" Sarah had to admit he had a point. She looked around the opulent penthouse, at the man who claimed to be a vampire, at the ring on her finger that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. "This is really happening," she said, more to herself than to him. "This is really happening," Alexander confirmed. "Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Cross." As if summoned by his words, a woman appeared in the doorway. She was tall and elegant, with silver hair and the same pale complexion as Alexander. Unlike the nervous judge and attorney, she seemed completely at ease. "Sarah, this is Elena Moreau. She'll help you get settled and show you around the city tomorrow. Elena has been my assistant for many years." Elena smiled, revealing the same sharp canine teeth that Alexander possessed. "Welcome to the family, dear. I think you're going to like it here." Sarah looked between them, realizing that she had stepped into a world she never could have imagined. A world where vampires ran cities, where power was measured in centuries rather than years, where her painful human life was just the first chapter of a much longer story. "I have just one question," Sarah said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "Of course," Alexander replied. "Why me? Out of everyone in this city, why did you choose me?" Alexander's smile was genuine for the first time that evening, warm despite his cold nature. "Because, my dear Sarah, you were the only person I watched who never stopped fighting. Even when you were beaten down, even when you had nothing left, you never gave up. That kind of strength is rare, even among my kind." He moved to the window again, looking out at the city lights. "And because you were the first person in a very long time who made me remember what it felt like to want to protect something precious." Sarah joined him at the window, looking out at Phoenix spread below them like a glittering map. Somewhere down there was her old apartment, her old life, her old fears. They seemed impossibly small from this height. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you rest. Tomorrow Elena will take you shopping for clothes befitting your new station. You'll meet some of the other members of our community. You'll begin to understand exactly what it means to be married to someone like me." Alexander placed his cold hand over hers on the window glass. "And soon, when you're ready, you'll decide whether you want this life to be temporary or eternal." Sarah looked at their joined hands, her warm and human, his cold and otherworldly. 6 hours ago, she had been a frightened waitress with bruises on her arms and $27 in tips. Now she was the wife of what appeared to be the most powerful man in Phoenix, living in luxury she had never dreamed possible. It was insane. It was impossible. It was the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to her. And for the first time in her adult life, Sarah felt truly, completely safe. As Alexander led her to a bedroom that was larger than her old apartment, Sarah caught sight of herself in an antique mirror. The frightened, beaten-down girl was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who belonged in this world of shadows and power. Someone who had chosen her own fate for the first time in her life. The bed was enormous, with silk sheets and more pillows than one person could possibly need. Alexander kissed her forehead gently, his lips cold but somehow comforting. Sleep well, Mrs. Kai. Cross. Tomorrow your real education begins. After he left, Sarah lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of the city far below. She thought about Robert, probably waking up to find his life destroyed by forces he would never understand. She thought about her mother, who would have to learn to survive without someone to blame for her own failures. Most of all, she thought about Alexander and the way he had looked at her when he said she had surprised him. No one had ever seen strength in her before. No one had ever wanted to protect her. As sleep finally took her, Sarah's last conscious thought was that she might have married a monster, but for the first time in her life, she was the monster's chosen one, and somehow that felt like the beginning of everything rather than the end. Sarah woke up in silk pajamas she didn't remember putting on, in a bed softer than clouds, with sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked a city she was only beginning to understand. For a moment, she thought it had all been an elaborate dream, until she saw the heavy red ring on her finger and remembered everything. Elena knocked softly on the bedroom door before entering with a silver tray. Coffee, fresh fruit, pastries that looked like works of art, and a single red rose in a crystal vase. "Good morning, Mrs. Cross," Elena said with a warm smile. "Alexander had to attend to some business downtown, but he asked me to make sure you were comfortable." Sarah sat up in bed, still trying to process her new reality. Business? Alexander owns several companies in the city: construction, real estate, entertainment. He's built quite an empire over the decades. Elena set the tray on the bedside table. He also has other responsibilities. Our kind has certain obligations to maintain order. Our kind, Sarah repeated. How many of you are there? In Phoenix? Perhaps 30 or 40. Worldwide? Elena shrugged elegantly. More than humans would be comfortable knowing about, fewer than the movies suggest. Sarah sipped the coffee, which was perfect, like everything else in this strange new world. How long have you been? A vampire? About 80 years. I was turned during the Great Depression by someone much like Alexander, desperate, afraid, with nowhere else to go. Elena's eyes grew distant. It was the best decision I ever made. After breakfast, Elena led Sarah through the penthouse, pointing out rooms she hadn't seen the night before. There was a library with books in languages Sarah couldn't identify, some so old they looked like they might crumble at a touch. A music room with instruments from different centuries. An office with computer screens showing stock prices, real estate transactions, and what looked like surveillance footage from around the city. Alexander likes to stay informed, Elena explained when she noticed Sarah staring at the screens. The closet in the master bedroom was the size of Sarah's old apartment, filled with clothes that still had tags on them. Evening gowns, business suits, casual wear, all in her exact size. How did he know my measurements? Sarah asked, holding up a dress that would have cost her 3 months' salary at the diner. Elena smiled mysteriously. Alexander is very thorough when he sets his mind on something. He's been watching you for several months, learning your routines, your preferences. He wanted to be prepared when he finally approached you. The thought should have been creepy, but somehow Sarah found it flattering. After years of being invisible, of having no one care enough to really see her, the idea that someone had been paying such close attention was intoxicating. They spent the morning shopping, though it was unlike any shopping trip Sarah had ever experienced. Elena led her to stores that didn't advertise, exclusive boutiques where the salespeople knew Elena by name and treated Sarah like royalty. No prices were mentioned, no credit cards were needed. Elena simply pointed to what she wanted, and it was packaged and sent to the penthouse. How does Alexander afford all this? Sarah asked as they left the fourth luxury boutique. Time, Elena said simply. When you have centuries to build wealth, compound interest becomes your best friend. Alexander bought land in Phoenix when it was worth nothing. He invested in companies before they became household names. He made deals with people who owed him favors and collected on them decades later. They had lunch at an elegant restaurant where the maître d' personally escorted them to a private dining room. The other patrons looked like politicians, celebrities, and business leaders Sarah recognized from newspaper photos. Does everyone know what Alexander is? Sarah asked, watching a man who looked like the governor nod respectfully to Elena. Not exactly. They know he's powerful, that he gets results, that it's better to be his friend than his enemy. The details of his nature are less important than his influence. After lunch, Elena took Sarah to a spa that felt more like a temple. They were pampered and polished until Sarah barely recognized herself in the mirrors. Her hair, which she had always cut herself with kitchen scissors, was now styled by someone who treated it like precious silk. Her nails, usually bitten to the quick from stress, were now perfect ovals painted deep red to match her wedding ring. "Alexander will be pleased," Elena said as they prepared to leave. "He has particular appreciation for beauty." As the sun began to set, they returned to the Crimson Tower. Sarah expected to find Alexander waiting, but the penthouse was empty except for the ever-present servants who appeared and disappeared like ghosts. "Where is he?" Sarah asked. Elena's expression grew serious. "There's something you need to understand about your husband, dear. The night is when our kind comes alive. Alexander has responsibilities, territories to patrol, people to meet with. The supernatural world has its own politics, and he's a key player." "Supernatural world? Vampires aren't the only things that go bump in the night, Sarah. There are werewolves in the mountains outside the city, witches who run businesses downtown, spirits that haunt the old buildings. Someone has to maintain the balance, make sure the human world stays oblivious." The idea was overwhelming. Sarah had gone from a world where her biggest worry was having enough money for bus fare to one where monsters were real and apparently had their own government. Elena must have seen the panic in her eyes because she placed a comforting hand on Sarah's arm. "Don't worry, dear. Alexander is very good at what he does. He's kept this city peaceful for over a century." "Over a century? How old is he?" "That's a question you should ask him yourself." Alexander arrived just after midnight, appearing in the penthouse so quietly that Sarah jumped when she saw him standing in the living room. He looked exactly the same as the night before, not a hair out of place, but there was something different in his energy, more alert, more predatory. "How was your first day as my wife?" he asked, his voice warm despite his cold nature. "Overwhelming," Sarah admitted. "Elena has been wonderful, but I feel like I'm learning a completely new language." Alexander smiled, moving to pour himself a glass of the dark red liquid Sarah now understood probably wasn't wine. "It will take time, decades perhaps, but you're intelligent and adaptable. You'll learn." He sat beside her on the leather couch, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and slightly old-fashioned. "Are you having second thoughts?" Sarah considered lying, but something about Alexander demanded honesty. "I'm terrified," she said, "but not of you, of how much my life has changed in 24 hours. And are you happy with the change?" Sarah looked around the opulent penthouse, thought about Elena's kindness, about the way store clerks had treated her with respect instead of suspicion. She thought about waking up without fear for the first time in years. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with how certain she sounded. "I think I am." Alexander's smile was pleased and proud. "Excellent, because I have something to show you." He led her to the office with all the computer screens. With a few keystrokes, he brought up what looked like surveillance footage from her old neighborhood. Sarah watched in fascination as the screen showed Robert stumbling out of their apartment building with a single suitcase, looking around in confusion before getting into a cab. "He left this morning," Alexander said. "The bus ticket I arranged will take him to Seattle, where he has a job waiting at a warehouse. Nothing glamorous, but honest work." "He won't be drinking anymore. How can you be sure?" Alexander's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. "I've arranged for him to lose his taste for alcohol, literally. From now on, even the smell will make him violently ill." Sarah stared at the screen where her stepfather had disappeared. "You can do that? Control people like that? Within limits. I can't change someone's fundamental nature, but I can adjust their preferences, their impulses." Robert was a weak man who used alcohol to justify his cruelty. Remove the alcohol, replace the environment that enabled his behavior, and he becomes manageable. Another screen showed Sarah's mother, Linda, sitting in a hospital waiting room, her arm in a sling. She looked older than Sarah remembered, more fragile. What happened to her? Robert's final tantrum. She'll recover fully, and she's already been visited by a social worker who helped her apply for assistance programs. She'll have enough money to live comfortably, and she's enrolled in therapy sessions that she'll actually attend. You arranged all of that too? I told you, Sarah. Very little happens in this city without my influence. Sarah felt a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. Alexander had solved problems that had plagued her entire life with what seemed like casual ease, but the power required to orchestrate such changes was staggering. Why? She asked. Why go to so much trouble for people you don't even know? Alexander turned away from the screens to face her fully. Because they mattered to you, because your past shapes who you are, and I wanted to ensure that past could no longer hurt you. The simple statement hit Sarah harder than she expected. No one in her life had ever cared enough about her well-being to take action on her behalf. Alexander had rearranged entire lives just to make her more comfortable. I don't know how to thank you, she said quietly. There's no need. You're my wife now. Your happiness is my responsibility. Alexander moved closer, his cold fingers tilting her chin up so she was looking directly into his strange, beautiful eyes. But there is something I need from you tonight. Sarah's pulse quickened, and she was certain Alexander could hear it. What? I haven't fed since the night we met. I'm beginning to feel the hunger, and it's affecting my control. His fingers traced along her neck, following the path of her pulse. I promised you would barely feel it, and I meant that. But I need to know you consent freely. The rational part of Sarah's mind screamed at her to run, but the larger part, the part that had been transformed by 24 hours of respect and luxury and safety, found herself nodding. Okay, she whispered. Alexander's pupils dilated and his canine teeth grew visibly longer. But his touch remained gentle as he positioned her more comfortably on the couch, her head tilted to expose the curve of her neck. Relax, he murmured against her skin. Think about how different you feel now than you did yesterday, how strong, how protected. The first touch of his teeth was a sharp pinch, no worse than getting an injection at the doctor's office. But then something strange happened. Instead of pain, Sarah felt a warm, floating sensation spreading through her body. It was like being wrapped in the softest blanket, like sinking into the perfect bath, like the moment just before falling asleep when all worry disappears. She could feel Alexander drawing blood from her, but rather than weakness, she felt an odd sense of completion, as if some circuit that had been broken her entire life was finally connecting. When he pulled away, she felt dizzy but not unwell. More like she'd had exactly the right amount of wine with dinner. How do you feel? Alexander asked, his teeth back to normal, his eyes full of concern. Sarah considered the question seriously. Different. But not bad different, like something inside me has settled into place. Alexander's expression grew thoughtful. Interesting. Most humans feel depleted after feeding. You seem energized. Is that unusual? Very. It suggests you have more compatibility with our nature than most humans. Alexander helped her to her feet, studying her face carefully. Have you always healed quickly from injuries? Sarah thought about it. Despite Robert's regular beatings, she rarely had bruises that lasted more than a day or two. Cuts seemed to close themselves faster than they should. She had always attributed it to good genetics. I suppose so. Why? Because you might be one of the rare humans who could transition to our kind without losing their essential self. Most people who are turned become shadows of who they were before. But you, Alexander trailed off, shaking his head. It's too early to be certain, but the signs are promising. They spent the rest of the night talking. Alexander told her about the city's hidden supernatural community, about alliances and territories and ancient feuds that played out in boardrooms and back alleys. Sarah learned that the mayor was a witch, that the police chief was a werewolf, and that several of the city's most successful businesses were fronts for supernatural operations. It sounds like organized crime. Alexander laughed, a sound like silver bells. In many ways it is. But it's organized crime with rules, with honor codes, with consequences for those who step out of line. The alternative is chaos, humans discovering our existence, panic, and violence on a scale you can't imagine. As dawn approached, Alexander grew visibly tired. Sarah had noticed he avoided windows during daylight hours, and she was beginning to understand why. "Sunlight weakens us," he explained. "We won't burst into flames like in the movies, but prolonged exposure is unpleasant. Most of our kind sleep during the day." He showed Sarah to a room she hadn't seen before, one with no windows and walls that seemed to absorb sound. The bed was smaller than the one in the master bedroom, but somehow more intimate. "This is where I rest," Alexander said. "You're welcome to join me, but I understand if you prefer your own space." Sarah looked at the windowless room, at the man who had already changed her life so completely, and made her decision. She climbed into the bed beside him, letting him pull her close against his cold body. "Alexander," she said into the darkness. "How long have you been alone?" She felt his chest rise and fall with an unnecessary breath. "Longer than you've been alive. Longer than most civilizations have existed." "Doesn't it get lonely?" "I thought it did. But now I realize I was simply waiting for the right person to share eternity with." Sarah felt sleep pulling at her, the after effects of the feeding and the emotional weight of everything she had learned. But before she succumbed, she had one more question. "When you watched me all those months, what did you see that made you choose me?" Alexander's arm tightened around her protectively. "I saw a woman who got knocked down every day but got back up every morning. I saw someone who never lost her capacity for hope even when she had every reason to give up. I saw strength that had been tested by fire and refused to break." His lips brushed against her hair as he continued. "And I saw someone who deserved to be treasured instead of tormented." As Sarah drifted off to sleep in the arms of her vampire husband, she thought about how strange it was that she felt safer with a creature who drank blood than she ever had with the humans who were supposed to love her. The last thing she remembered before sleep took her was Alexander's voice, so quiet she might have imagined it. "Sleep well, my dear one. Tomorrow night, I'll begin teaching you what it really means to be powerful." Sarah's dreams were filled with red eyes and city lights, with the feeling of flying over streets that sparkled like jewels. In her dreams, she was no longer the frightened girl from the diner. She was something new, something stronger, something that belonged in a world of shadows and secrets. When she woke the next evening, she would discover that her dreams had been more prophetic than she realized. Alexander Cross had chosen his bride carefully, and Sarah Martinez was about to learn exactly what it meant to be married to the most powerful vampire in Phoenix. But first, she would have to survive meeting the rest of his family. Sarah woke to the sound of voices she didn't recognize coming from the living room. Alexander was already awake beside her, his body tense in a way she hadn't seen before. "They're early," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Who's early?" Alexander sat up, running a hand through his dark hair. "My family. I had planned to introduce you to them gradually, but it seems they've decided to expedite the process." The voices from the living room grew louder, and Sarah could make out at least 3 distinct speakers, all with the same refined, ageless quality as Alexander's voice. "Are they like you?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Yes, and they're about to judge whether you're worthy of the cross name." Alexander stood and began dressing in clothes that appeared to have been laid out by the invisible servants. "Some of them have been with me for centuries. They're not accustomed to me making impulsive decisions." And Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest. What if they don't like me? Alexander paused in buttoning his shirt, looking at her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "Then we'll deal with it together. But Sarah, you must understand something about my kind. We respect strength above all else. Don't let them intimidate you, and don't apologize for who you are." Elena appeared in the doorway with clothes for Sarah, a midnight blue dress that looked like it cost more than Sarah had made in a year at the diner. "They're waiting," Elena said to Alexander, then turned to Sarah with an encouraging smile. "Don't worry, dear. Just be yourself." The living room had been transformed. Candles flickered from every surface, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The modern furniture had been replaced with antique pieces that looked like they belonged in a museum. And standing around the room were 4 figures who could only be Alexander's vampire family. The woman nearest the window was tall and elegant, with platinum blonde hair styled in a way that suggested the 1940s. Her pale skin was flawless, and her eyes were the same red-flecked gold as Alexander's. She wore a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. "This is Victoria Blackwood," Alexander said, his arm around Sarah's waist. "Victoria, my wife Sarah." Victoria's smile was polite but cold as she looked Sarah up and down with obvious assessment. "Charming," she said in a voice like expensive champagne. "How unexpected." The man beside her was shorter but broader, with dark hair and the kind of build that suggested he had been turned during a more physical era. His handshake was firm enough to be painful. "Marcus Stone," he introduced himself. "I've been with Alexander for 3 centuries. Pleased to meet you." Unlike Victoria, Marcus seemed genuinely welcoming, though Sarah could sense he was studying her just as carefully. The third vampire was a woman who couldn't have been more than 19 when she was turned with red hair and freckles that made her look deceptively innocent. Her name was Isabella Chen, and she had been part of Alexander's family for only 50 years. "Finally," Isabella said, clapping her hands together. "I was beginning to think Alexander was going to spend eternity alone and boring." The fourth vampire made Sarah's breath catch. He was easily the most beautiful man she had ever seen, with golden hair and features that belonged on a Renaissance statue. But there was something predatory in his smile that made her instinctively step closer to Alexander. "Damien Rousseau," he said, taking Sarah's hand and kissing it in a gesture that managed to be both elegant and vaguely threatening. "I'm sure we'll become very well acquainted." Alexander's arm tightened protectively around Sarah's waist, and she noticed the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Damien," Alexander said evenly, "I trust you'll remember that Sarah is my wife." Damien's smile widened, showing teeth that were definitely sharper than they should be. "Of course!" I would never forget such an important detail. Elena bustled in with drinks for everyone, the same dark red liquid Alexander preferred, served in crystal glasses that caught the candlelight like liquid rubies. Sarah was offered wine, which she gratefully accepted. "So," Victoria said, settling gracefully onto the antique sofa, "tell us about yourself, Sarah." "Alexander has been rather secretive about where he found you." Sarah felt 4 pairs of ancient eyes focused on her with laser intensity. Her first instinct was to make herself smaller to apologize for taking up space, but Alexander's words echoed in her mind. "Don't let them intimidate you, and don't apologize for who you are." "I worked at Murphy's Diner on 5th Street, Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. "Before that, I lived with my mother and stepfather in a situation that wasn't good for anyone involved." "How refreshingly honest," Damien said with amusement. "Most humans try to make themselves sound more impressive when they meet us." "I'm not trying to impress anyone. Alexander chose me as I am. If that's not good enough for his family, then perhaps the problem isn't with me." The silence that followed was so complete Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. Then Marcus began to chuckle, a sound like rolling thunder. "I like her," he announced. "She's got spine." Isabella nodded enthusiastically. "And she's not afraid of us." "That's rare." Victoria's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sarah thought she detected a hint of approval in the older vampire's eyes. "Interesting. And what do you think of our world so far, Sarah?" "Is it what you expected when you married Alexander?" "I didn't know what to expect," Sarah admitted. "I'm still learning." "But I'm not afraid of it, even knowing what we are, what Alexander is." Sarah looked at her husband, at the man who had rescued her from a life of fear and given her more luxury and kindness than she had ever dreamed possible. "Especially knowing what he is." Damien leaned forward in his chair, his golden eyes fixed on Sarah with uncomfortable intensity. "And you're prepared to live forever? To watch everyone you've ever known grow old and die? To potentially become a predator yourself?" "Damien," Alexander warned, his voice carrying an edge Sarah had never heard before. "No, it's okay," Sarah said, meeting Damien's gaze directly. "Those are fair questions." She paused, thinking carefully about her answer. The only people I've ever known have already hurt me more than any stranger could. As for becoming a predator, I've spent my whole life being prey. I think I'd like to try something different. This time, the silence was broken by Victoria's laugh, a sound like silver wind chimes. Oh, Alexander, you have chosen well. She's going to fit right in. The tension in the room shifted, becoming less about judgment and more about curiosity. Marcus began telling stories about Alexander's early days in Phoenix, when it was barely more than a trading post. Isabella shared gossip about other vampire families in cities across the country. Even Victoria warmed up, offering fashion advice and promising to introduce Sarah to the best designers in the supernatural community. Only Damien remained somewhat aloof, watching Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. When the others were distracted by Marcus's increasingly dramatic storytelling, he moved to sit beside her on the sofa. "You intrigue me," he said quietly, his voice pitched so only she could hear. "Most humans who marry into our kind are seeking immortality or power, but you seem different." "Different how? You seem like someone who would have been perfectly content to remain human if Alexander hadn't offered you an alternative." Damien's golden eyes studied her face carefully. "That makes you either very wise or very dangerous." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Alexander appeared beside them with vampire speed, his hand resting possessively on Sarah's shoulder. "Damien, perhaps you could help Elena with refreshments?" It wasn't a request, and Damien smiled as he stood. "Of course. We'll continue our conversation later, Sarah." As the night progressed, Sarah began to understand the dynamics of Alexander's supernatural family. Victoria was clearly the matriarch, the one whose approval mattered most. Marcus was the enforcer, the one who handled problems that required a physical solution. Isabella was the scout, the one who moved through human society gathering information. And Damien was the diplomat, the one who negotiated with other supernatural powers. "What's my role?" Sarah asked Alexander when they had a moment alone. "Whatever you choose it to be," he replied. "This family has survived for centuries because we adapt, because we find ways to use everyone's strengths. We'll find your place in time." Around midnight, the conversation turned to business. Sarah learned that there was a territorial dispute brewing with a pack of werewolves in the neighboring state, that a group of rogue witches had been causing problems in the entertainment district, and that several young vampires in the city needed guidance before they attracted unwanted attention. "What about the Castellanos situation?" Victoria asked. Alexander's expression darkened. "Still unresolved. They're testing boundaries, seeing how far they can push before we respond." "Who are the Castellanos?" Sarah asked. "Another vampire family," Isabella explained. "They moved into Phoenix about 10 years ago and have been gradually trying to take over Alexander's territory. They're not strong enough for an open challenge, so they're trying more subtle approaches." "Like what?" "Buying property in our districts, offering better terms to businesses we protect, spreading rumors about Alexander losing his grip on the city," Marcus said, his voice growing angry. Classic political maneuvering. Sarah found herself thinking about the surveillance screens in Alexander's office, about the casual way he had destroyed Robert's life with a few phone calls. "What stops you from just removing them?" "Rules," Alexander said simply. "The supernatural world has laws just like the human world. We can't simply eliminate competition without justification. We need evidence of actual harm, not just inconvenience." "But if they're trying to take over your territory, isn't that justification enough?" Victoria laughed approvingly. "She thinks like one of us already." Alexander smiled, but there was something predatory in his expression. "The Castellanos are being very careful to stay within the technical boundaries of supernatural law. But you're right, Sarah. Territory challenges can't be ignored indefinitely." Damien returned from the kitchen with a thoughtful expression. "Perhaps it's time to send a message, something subtle but clear." "What kind of message?" Sarah asked. "The kind that demonstrates we have new resources they haven't accounted for," Alexander said, looking at Sarah with an expression that made her pulse quicken. Sarah was beginning to understand that her marriage to Alexander wasn't just personal, it was political. As his wife, she represented a change in the power structure, a new piece on the chessboard that other players would have to account for. What exactly are you expecting me to do? For now, learn. Watch? Understand how our world works, Alexander replied. Later, when you're ready, we'll discuss your more active participation. The family meeting continued until dawn, with Sarah absorbing information about supernatural politics, territorial boundaries, and the delicate balance of power that kept Phoenix peaceful. By the time the other vampires prepared to leave, she felt like she had attended a graduate course in a subject she never knew existed. Victoria was the last to say goodbye, taking Sarah's hands in her cold, elegant ones. "Welcome to the family, dear. Alexander has been alone far too long. I'm glad he finally found someone worthy of him." After the others had gone, Alexander and Sarah retreated to their windowless bedroom. Sarah's mind was spinning with everything she had learned, everything she had seen. "They're not just your friends," she said as Alexander held her in the darkness. "They're your counsel, your government, very astute. Yes, we function as both family and ruling body for the supernatural community in this region. Every major decision, every territorial dispute, every new threat is discussed among us. And now I'm part of that. Now you're part of that," Alexander agreed. "How do you feel about it?" Sarah considered the question seriously. 12 hours ago, she had been a nobody with no power and no prospects. Now she was married to what amounted to a supernatural king, with a voice in decisions that affected thousands of creatures she was only beginning to understand existed. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also excited. I've never been part of something important before." Alexander's arms tightened around her. "You'll learn quickly. You're intelligent and you have something most of our kind lost centuries ago." "What's that?" "The ability to see situations from a human perspective. That's invaluable when dealing with problems that affect both worlds." As Sarah drifted towards sleep, she thought about Damien's words. He had said she seemed different from other humans who married into vampire families, that she would have been content to remain human. He was right, she realized. She hadn't sought Alexander out, hadn't asked for this life. But now that she had it, she was determined to make the most of it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of education and adjustment. Elena taught Sarah about supernatural history, about the ancient feuds and alliances that shaped their world. Marcus showed her the physical side of vampire existence, how their enhanced strength and speed worked, how to defend herself if necessary. Isabella introduced her to the social network of supernatural creatures in Phoenix, from the werewolf pack that ran a successful security company to the coven of witches who operated several high-end restaurants. Victoria became Sarah's guide to vampire politics, teaching her the subtle art of negotiation and influence that kept their world functioning. And Alexander began sharing the details of his business empire, showing her how he had built and maintained power in both the human and supernatural worlds. But it was during her third week as Mrs. Cross that Sarah truly understood what her new life meant. She was alone in the penthouse, reviewing financial reports Alexander had asked her to examine, when the elevator opened to reveal a man she had never seen before. He was tall and thin, with the pale complexion of a vampire. But something about him seemed wrong. His movements were too sharp, his smile too wide, and his eyes held a hunger that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Mrs. Cross," he said, his voice sickeningly sweet. "What a pleasure to finally meet you." Sarah stood slowly, every instinct screaming danger. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Lorenzo Castellano," the man replied, moving deeper into the room with predatory grace. "I believe my family and your husband have some unresolved issues." Sarah's mind raced. The Castellanos, the rival vampire family that had been testing Alexander's boundaries, and now one of them was in their home, alone with her. "Alexander isn't here," she said carefully. "I know. He's downtown, meeting with the mayor about some zoning issues. He won't be back for hours." Lorenzo's smile grew wider. "Which gives us plenty of time to get acquainted." Sarah reached for her phone, but Lorenzo moved with vampire speed, appearing beside her and gently taking the device from her hands. "I don't think we'll be needing that," he said. I just want to talk. About what? About your husband's stubborn refusal to share this beautiful city. About the unfortunate misunderstanding that has developed between our families. About how a smart woman like you might help resolve these issues. Lorenzo moved to the bar and poured himself a drink, acting for all the world like he was a welcome guest. You see, Sarah, your marriage has complicated things for my family. Oh, Alexander was predictable when he was alone, but now he has something precious to protect, something that might make him reckless. Understanding dawned on Sarah like ice water in her veins. You're here to threaten me? Such an ugly word. I'm here to offer you an opportunity to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. Lorenzo turned to face her fully, and Sarah saw that his eyes had shifted to the red gold of a vampire ready to feed. All you have to do is convince your husband that sharing Phoenix would be in everyone's best interest. The Castellanos don't want war, Sarah. We just want our fair share of the territory. And if I refuse? Lorenzo's smile became something from a nightmare. Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that. It would be such a shame if something happened to Alexander's beautiful new bride before she had a chance to explore her full potential. Sarah felt fear trying to take hold of her, the same paralyzing terror she had lived with for years in her stepfather's house. But something had changed in her during these weeks of safety and power. The frightened girl from the diner was gone, replaced by someone who belonged in this world of shadows and strength. You made a mistake coming here, Sarah said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. Lorenzo laughed. Did I? You're human, Sarah. Fragile. Weak. What exactly do you think you can do to me? Sarah smiled, and for the first time she understood why Alexander's expressions could be so predatory. I can do this. She pressed a button on the coffee table that Alexander had shown her during her first week. A panic button connected directly to his family's emergency network. Within seconds, alarms would be sounding in locations across the city. Lorenzo's amusement vanished. Clever girl, but not clever enough. He moved towards Sarah with inhuman speed, but she was ready for him. Marcus had taught her that vampires, for all their strength and speed, were still bound by physics. She couldn't match Lorenzo's power, but she could use his momentum against him. As he reached for her, Sarah ducked and rolled, grabbing a heavy crystal vase from the coffee table and hurling it at the floor-to-ceiling window. The glass shattered with a sound like thunder, letting in the late afternoon sunlight. Lorenzo screamed, his pale skin beginning to smoke where the sun touched it. He stumbled backward, seeking shadows, giving Sarah the time she needed to reach Alexander's desk and the weapon she knew he kept there. The silver dagger felt impossibly heavy in her human hands, but when Lorenzo came at her again, weakened by the sunlight but still dangerous, Sarah was ready. She didn't try to match his strength. Instead, she used her smaller size to stay mobile, keeping the sunlight between them, forcing him to choose between pursuing her and protecting himself from the light. You little bitch, Lorenzo snarled, his perfect face twisted with rage and pain. I'm going to tear your throat out. You're welcome to try, Sarah replied, and meant it. The standoff lasted only minutes before the elevator opened to reveal Alexander, his family close behind him. The temperature in the room plummeted as 4 ancient vampires took in the scene. Sarah armed and defiant, Lorenzo burned and trapped by sunlight, the shattered window that had turned the penthouse into a weapon. Lorenzo, Alexander said, his voice so cold it could have frozen blood. This is unexpected. Alexander, thank God you're here, Lorenzo said, instantly switching tactics. Your wife attacked me. I came here to negotiate peacefully and she tried to kill me. Alexander looked at Sarah, taking in her defensive position, the dagger in her hand, the way she had used the sunlight strategically. His smile was proud and terrifying. Is that what happened, my dear? He threatened me, Sarah said simply. He tried to use me to pressure you into giving up territory. When I refused, he became violent. Alexander nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected. I see. And how did you respond? I defended myself and our home, Victoria laughed, the sound like breaking crystal. Oh, I like her even more now. Marcus cracked his knuckles. Should I remove the trash, Alexander? Not yet, Alexander replied, moving closer to Lorenzo but staying out of the sunlight. Lorenzo, you violated several supernatural laws today. Entering another vampire's territory without permission, threatening a family member, attempting to harm a protected human. She's not protected, Lorenzo protested. She's not one of us. No, Alexander agreed, she's not. She's something much more dangerous. She's a human who isn't afraid of us. Damien appeared beside Lorenzo with vampire speed, his hand closing around the intruder's throat. The penalty for threatening a cross-family member is death. But Alexander is merciful. You get to deliver a message to your family instead. Alexander moved to Sarah's side, gently taking the dagger from her hands. Tell your father that Phoenix belongs to the Cross family. It has for over a century, and it will continue to do so. Any further attempts to challenge our authority will be met with the full force of supernatural law. Lorenzo nodded frantically, his earlier arrogance completely gone. I understand. It won't happen again. No, Alexander agreed. It won't. Because if any member of the Castellano family comes near my wife again, I will personally ensure that your entire bloodline ceases to exist. Are we clear? Crystal clear. Damien released Lorenzo, who immediately headed for the elevator. But Alexander's voice stopped him before he reached it. Lorenzo, one more thing. The rival vampire turned back, his face a mask of barely controlled fear. My wife handled herself admirably today. She showed intelligence, resourcefulness, and courage. If your family is looking for weakness in the cross-bloodline, I suggest you look elsewhere. After Lorenzo was gone, Alexander turned to Sarah with an expression of pure admiration. That was magnificently done. I was terrified, Sarah admitted. But you didn't let the fear control you. You used your environment, you called for backup, and you held your ground. Alexander pulled her into his arms, his cold body somehow warming her. You fought like one of us. Isabella clapped her hands together excitedly. Can we turn her now? Please? She's already more vampire than some actual vampires I know. That's Sarah's choice to make, Alexander said. But I admit, after today's display, I'm very curious to see what she would become with our full abilities. Sarah looked around at Alexander's family, at the pride and acceptance in their ancient eyes. She thought about Lorenzo's threats, about the way he had underestimated her, about how satisfying it had been to prove him wrong. What exactly would it involve, she asked. The turning process? Victoria stepped forward with a smile that was equal parts maternal and predatory. Pain initially, 3 days of your body dying and being reborn. But then you would be truly immortal. Faster, stronger, more resilient than any human, and you would have forever to explore the full extent of your potential. Sarah looked at Alexander, at the man who had already given her more safety and power than she had ever dreamed possible. What do you think? I think, Alexander said, his red-gold eyes glowing with love and pride. The question is whether you want to be extraordinarily human or extraordinarily vampire. Sarah considered everything that had brought her to this moment. The years of abuse and fear, the desperate night when she had married a stranger, the weeks of learning about a world she never knew existed, and now the choice to become something more than human, to claim power that could protect not just herself but others who might need it. I want to be extraordinary, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Alexander's smile was triumphant. Then we'll begin preparations immediately, but first let's take care of that window. We can't have you bursting into flames on your first day as a vampire. As his family laughed and began discussing the logistics of turning a human, Sarah looked out through the shattered window at the city spread below them. Somewhere out there, Lorenzo was delivering Alexander's message to the Castellano family. Soon, every supernatural creature in Phoenix would know that the Cross family had gained a new member, one who had already proven she belonged in their world of shadows and power. Sarah Martinez, the frightened waitress, was gone forever. In her place stood Sarah Cross, vampire-to-be, ready to claim her place in a larger, darker, infinitely more exciting world. And as Alexander's cold lips met hers in a kiss that tasted of eternity, Sarah realized that sometimes the most dangerous decision was the one that led to everything you never knew you wanted. The transformation would hurt, she knew that. But she had survived pain before. This time, instead of being broken by it, she would emerge from it, reborn as something magnificent and terrible and utterly free. The girl who had tied the knot with a vampire stranger to escape her abusive past was about to become the woman who would help rule a supernatural empire, and she had never been more ready for anything in her life. She tied the knot with a vampire stranger to leave her abusive home, not knowing he owned the city.